Katherine, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Pray podcast today.
I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for giving me the time.
You're very welcome. So can you give myself and the audience a little bit of background about who you are and what you do?
Sure. I am a retired FBI agent. I spent 20 years with the FBI. Managing when I left, I was running and managing their active shooter program, which is really about mass shootings. But before that, I was a prosecutor in Chicago. I was an agent for 20 years, but before that, I was a prosecutor in Chicago. Before that, a journalist in Chicago and Michigan. I was born and raised in Detroit and Michigan. So go Tigers, go Lions, go Michigan State, Spartans. Those are my cues.
Nice. And so how did you get into FBI and active shooting, mass shooting?
So the FBI is it's a job like every other job, right? And I was a special agent with the FBI, and agents do what they're assigned to do. So although I had been working national security matters, counterterrorism, and cyber crimes and espionage and things like that, when the Sandy Hook massacre happened in December of 2012, I was kind of voluntold, hey, we need you to do this now. Stand up a program, go join then Vice President Biden's White House team, and you need to work with the other components in the federal government, Department of Health and Human Services, Department of the Homeland Security, the Department of Education, FEMA. Go work with the other departments and the White House team on Mr. Biden's team and come up with solutions and see what you can come up with. And so we did that. We were assigned, okay, you guys are going to work every day, figure it out. And because we're going to work every day, figure it out, it was very intense. We were very focused on what is the problem, what's going on. And the product of that were a lot of best practices. I spent a tremendous amount of time with parents whose kids had been killed and schools that had been shot up, principals and things like that. I learned a tremendous amount. And out of that came things like Run, Hide, Fight, for example, which I think a lot of people are familiar with now.
So let's take a step back and let's define, what is a mass shooting, because I think there's different reports will call it something different. And just for the purpose of our discussion, let's use specific terminology.
Yeah, I think that's good. I love that you start there because it is the essence of the challenge with the numbers. So there is no federal definition for mass shootings. That is the first answer. Because there is no federal definition, definitions are defined. The definitions are created by researchers. So some researchers say, we want to look at all shootings where 3 people have been killed, or we want to look at all shootings where 4 people have been killed. The FBI research doesn't look at any number killed, but the FBI's research is about where does the incident occur? Does it happen in public? Is there a shooter out there trying to kill a bunch of people in a public place? And so that's the FBI counts those. They don't call them mass shootings; they call them active shooters. So the FBI counts active shooters, but a lot of researchers through the years have gathered numbers based on how many people have been killed at the scene. And so there's no real definition for it. In general, Department of Justice in all of our meetings, what we'd like to see is a definition that doesn't have a number. And that's what the Department of Justice says. But it does say, where a lot of people are killed intentionally by an individual who wants to commit, who is intending to commit violence, even if they don't actually kill a bunch of people. So you could have a mass shooting where somebody is running through the mall, firing, an AR-15 style weapon, and maybe they injure 25 people, but they don't kill any.
Yeah.
In some research, that wouldn't count, right? And we want to capture those. So that's why the FBI calls those active shooter situations.
Gotcha.
And I know it's complicated.
Well, but I think it's important because, you hear different talking heads say, oh, there's this many mass shootings.
Right.
Oh, no, No, that number's inflated. It's really only 10% of that number. And
you know what? Let me add one thing. Here's one of the things. You're right. So when you hear something on the news or on social media, the numbers they're using are just based on how a particular research team is tallying them. But one of the things that probably most Americans don't understand and appreciate is that most mass killings in any version of them, 3 or 4 people killed, most mass killings occur in the home and in the neighborhoods. So, for example, the FBI wouldn't count those necessarily if they were in a home, murder, suicide, a domestic situation, which is like maybe as many as half mass shootings are domestic situations. If a gentleman kills his wife and 3 children, and maybe I shouldn't say gentleman, but if a man kills his wife, 3 children, or a woman kills her 4 children, those are all mass killings, right?
Yeah.
They're all mass, or if it involves a weapon, they're mass shootings, but they're not going to come into a lot of other databases because they occur in the home.
Gotcha. So FBI is looking stuff that's more public, where other researchers are potentially looking at all shootings, whether they're public, domestic.
Exactly. And it all depends on the criteria they're using. So I would say if you hear a database, if you hear a comment on a number, look at the bottom of the screen and see where they get their information. Is it from the Washington Post? Is it from USA Today, which is a great resource? USA Today has a great counting system. Is it Gun Violence Archives? There's a lot of, or is it the FBI? There's a lot of different people counting a lot of different numbers, and none of the numbers are wrong. They're just based on different criteria.
Yeah. Is it the sort of things that the numbers are used to support to support the political view of the person speaking? Okay.
I don't think the numbers are not gathered for the political views, but I think that the different media outlets, different social media personalities choose to use particular numbers based on their particular political their particular position that they're pushing, I think is more common.
Yeah.
But bottom line is the numbers are true. You just have to know what they actually are counting. Because, for instance, in the United States, gun violence itself, more than half of the people who died from gun violence die from suicide.
Yeah.
So, so people don't think of that, but suicide is, if we were looking at what is the biggest problem that we have in gun violence, then we should put every dime we have into suicide prevention, right? Yeah. We don't do that. So there all is a little bit of politics on it.
Is it that's just not as newsworthy, as dramatic, as gets people I don't want to say excited,
not a news story.
Suicide's
not a news story. I mean, I was a journalist, and I know that journalists, are trying to. They're giving the public what they want, and the public wants news stories, news stories. NEW. They want news stories. They want to know what's the latest trend. That's what the public wants, and that's what media, social media, traditional media tries to give them. And suicide is not a news story. It's a tough nut to crack. And we need to continue to go after it. And I think, I believe we're in the middle of Suicide Prevention Month right now. So while we're doing this recording, but it's not a news story.
Yeah. And and to me, that's a challenging thing is these conversations so often devolve into some really little sliver of what's happening that we lose kind of the bigger picture of what is going on broader in society.
Yeah, that's true. And I will say that I've had media producers, news producers, who've called me just in the last few months to say, is there another way we can tell the story about these shootings? Is there another way that we can tell these mass shooting stories so that it is more effective? We don't want to just run out and cover a story because people get shot. And I admire them for saying, that they want to do that and they want to look for a better way to tell the public and to look for better solutions. I like that.
So have you found a better way to talk about it?
Well, I don't know. I think I have. I think that it's all about the conversation. You have to keep having the conversation. That's why I actually, not to pitch a book, but I'm pitching a book. But that's why I wrote the second book I just released called How to Talk About Guns with Anyone, because nobody wants to talk about it fruitfully. And because we don't talk about it, we talk about, are you for guns or against guns? People ask me that all the time. I think it's like, what do you mean am I for or against? I was an FBI agent for 20 years. I'm all about guns in their own way, but the solutions, if that's the word, there are a lot of different things that we can do that we're trying. That I think we just have to keep talking about it. We have to keep trying these different things. Some people support Because I know you're going to say what, like what, um, right? You were going to say it, admit it.
Not yet. I was
Not
give me
yet,
a few minutes.
right. But so, I mean, some people say, oh, that you have to secure all guns, or you shouldn't allow concealed carry, or we should get rid of all semi-assault weapons, rifles and handguns. There's all these different solutions, and really what we lack is a lot of research on the effectiveness of a lot of those policies, because those policies, legislative pieces haven't been put into place. So we don't really have the research in a lot of cases to say this is the definitive way to get rid of this or that. But if we don't try some of those things, we're never going to figure it out. If we don't try seat belts as lap belts and then try the ones that go across all the way up to our shoulders, I mean, car accidents, we've reduced the death in car accidents because we first put lap belts on people, and then we realized that if we put a belt that goes all the way up to their shoulder, we could prevent them from going, going forward and breaking their spine and things like that. And so it's a tried, we got to try it and see. And I think, that's one of the things we need to do here when it comes to gun violence itself. We need to try some things to see and do some research to see whether they work. But I have gone down a rabbit hole. Sorry.
Yeah. No, rabbit holes are good. I like the seatbelt analogy because I think you could look at like professional race car drivers and the survivability of auto accidents there. Like you watch these things on TV and you're like, there's no way this person is going to survive. And they get out and they'll walk away because they've got neck restraints, helmets, they've got 5-point harnesses, and it makes that much more survivable. But there's also a tolerance for what the public, the practicality of what you can do in public. You can't go out and mandate, okay, well, if you're going to drive a car, you have to wear a neck brace, a helmet, and a 5-point harness. There's a practicality around what the public will accept.
What are the most effective things?
At least today, yeah. That might be the most effective thing that you can do is a 5-point harness, but the practicality of that in public is that it's not going to happen.
I think that is good, because if you something that you probably know, maybe your audience doesn't all know, is that in 2020, the CDC keeps track of all kinds of things. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention keeps track of all kinds of things. And in 2020, they determined that gun deaths for those 19 and younger children and youth 19 and younger exceeded the deaths by traffic accidents for the same age group, and those had always been higher for car accidents had always been higher, and now 19 and under gun violence is the highest incidence of death for those 19 and under, and auto deaths continues to go down. So gun violence continues to go up for that age group. Auto deaths goes down. How did it go down? There's more cars on the road. We're driving faster. There's more people driving, but we found ways to make the adjustments to bring down those auto industry accidents. Just because of what you said, we kind of balanced it out. We put in seatbelts, but we also lowered speeding rates in some areas. We legislated how and when kids could get driver's licenses. We don't let a 16-year-old with a new license drive with other people in their cars, because we know 16-year-olds are stupid. No offense to the 16-year-olds listening, but we've made all these little tooling adjustments state by state and at the federal level. And I think we need to do that, in the firearms industry, not because firearms themselves are dangerous or cars themselves are dangerous, because people with cars or people with firearms can be dangerous.
Yeah. So we'll pivot back to that, but let's talk a little bit about how has kind of law enforcement's response to shootings changed, and then we'll talk about what public's response, like what the public can do about shootings when they're happening.
Oh, sure. Sure. And thank you for asking, because I think the more that we talk about it, the more we can help educate people, the better, the safer we're all going to be. But I would say in the beginning, when we at the FBI, we focused on these public mass shootings because I think these are, and although incredibly rare, they're the things that we fear the most. There are so many things that you fear, but you don't really. The reality is that you don't have to worry about it, right? We do school fire drills in school all over the United States. 50 million kids run their fire drills 2 or 3 times a year, but we haven't lost a child to a fire in a school since the 1950s.
Oh, wow.
But we still run in Chicago, yeah. But we still run the drills. Why do we do it? We do it so that everybody's ready just in case, right? Because safety isn't about when it happens. Safety is about if it happens, right?
Yeah.
It may never happen. That's why you put your seatbelt on in an airplane, and you go through the safety drills every time on the airplane, because you just want to be sure that you know what to do if for some chance something happens. And in the United States, we never really dealt with in any great amount school shootings, and we never feared school shootings. And then Columbine happened. But there had been shootings before that in the 60s, 70s, 80s, Texas, California, a lot of other places. There had been shootings out in public, and we had tried to overcome those one at a time. But when the Columbine high school shooting happened, that really changed the personality of it changed the public's view, and it changed the personality of how law enforcement felt they needed to respond.
Mm-hmm.
So before, law enforcement was trained to contain and wait, meaning that the first officers who showed up created a perimeter and then made sure that nobody stepped in the perimeter and nobody got out of the perimeter if there were a bad guy. And then we waited for our special weapons and tactics teams, our SWAT teams, to arrive. And the SWAT teams arrived, and the SWAT teams had in fact been created after some of these earlier shootings, where we said, hey, we need to have really specialized people who know what to do. And instead of a law enforcement officer who might have a shotgun in his car and maybe a handgun on his hip, we need to train a special team that can come. And when there's a real problem, real bad problem, that special team, that SWAT team, can come and assault and handle this assault. So we created a situation, thinking it was best practices, to have officers who arrive at the scene contain and wait until SWAT arrived. But at Columbine, we waited, and SWAT arrived, and then SWAT worked out a lot of things, but SWAT didn't go right into the building right away. And however that impacted the deaths inside the building, it was perceived as a challenge and a failure of communications and entry. And after that, we began to teach law enforcement after Columbine that they must find a way to get inside the building quickly and swiftly, and that their primary job was to get to the shooter. Mm-hmm. So if you fast forward from 99 when that happened to 2012 when Sandy Hook happened, when I got assigned to run the FBI's program, create and run the FBI's program, we looked at, okay, what is law enforcement doing now? And one of the things that we found is that though some law enforcement that virtually all law enforcement had essentially access to some sort of SWAT teams, few law enforcement had the training to safely and successfully go in and neutralize a shooter. Mm-hmm. And that's really what we changed. We invested millions of your tax dollars in your listeners' tax dollars in training law enforcement across the country to respond the same way, so that we could be sure that if I arrive as a law enforcement officer, if I arrive at a scene, the other law enforcement officers who arrive at the scene are going to do the same thing that I do. We're going to have the same training to know for sure, just like your dentist knows how to take the cavity out, right? That we want everybody, when you go to the scene, we want everybody to respond the same way. And we changed that build up and created a situation where we anticipate and we expect now for all law enforcement, their first job is to neutralize the shooter, whether by shooting them, arresting them, whatever the situation is. But neutralize the shooter, then turn immediately to life safety to recover and save lives.
So has the studies been done to find out, is that more effective, or
it is more effective.
Believed to be more effective?
Yeah, I think it is. We're still piecing together the studies, right? And the more time you have, fortunately, even though it seems like these are occurring every day, these types of shootings are not as frequent as the news might make you think, these public mass shootings. So you have smaller number to look for your statistical significance. Yeah. But one of the things that we found in the FBI's research of 25 years of these shootings is that half of them occur in places of business, only about 20% in schools, right? So, I mean, that helps us to understand where the threats really are. and who might be the perpetrators, right? Because of course, in places of business, you have people who are employed and working there or are recently fired. So that skews the age up, for instance, for a shooter. But one of the things that we have found is that through the years, say this 25 years, we saw the number of incidents increase. So that is not a fallacy.
Mhm.
We've seen the number of incidents increase, but we haven't seen the number of casualties increase. And that tells me that the law enforcement response and civilian response
Mhm.
has been much more effective, where we've seen a lot less percentage-wise increase in casualties.
Gotcha. And we know there was the, and I can't think of the one in Texas recently, Uvalde, where
Uvalde, Texas, the elementary school.
yeah, where it looks like, or the perception is, I don't know the facts. I wasn't there, so I want to be careful. But perception was that law enforcement did not act in a consistent manner with what they were taught. So there's still a bit of, if things don't go right, if the first people on the scene aren't following the teachings and the practices,
Yeah.
that kind of everybody else showing up goes into almost like I'm just following orders now that someone else is in charge.
Yeah, I think that the Department of Justice actually, I think, hasn't released its Uvalde report yet, but my understanding is that the, just absolutely to what you mentioned, Uvalde Elementary School, 2 adults, 19 children killed. If I have my numbers right, I apologize if I don't. But the circumstances, what we absolutely saw were initial responders came right into the building, but then they didn't follow and pursue the shooter into the classroom where he was. And then after that, it became kind of a communications breakdown, and the subsequent events, the subsequent time that went by, didn't get any better.
Yeah.
And I think we'll see a very detailed report from the Department of Justice about the details of it. But in essence, you're right. I agree with you that the police response was not the protocol that we trained them in. And in fact, they had that training. But then once you don't execute that first few steps, a lot of confusion on the ground can make it really challenging. I know there were radio communications that talked about barricaded subjects, and that's a whole different protocol.
Yeah. And that's the challenge of when I say us, is the people that are not in law enforcement looking at it. We're like, oh, what's wrong with them? Why didn't they do X, Y, or Z?
Right.
It's a complicated situation with complicated responses depending on what the situation on the ground is.
Yeah. I think it's hard for any civilian or any person who hasn't been in that environment to truly appreciate how chaotic those kinds of scenes are. And it's easy afterwards. I mean, it's not easy, of course, but it's more understandable afterwards to see the communications and see where people moved and say, oh, I see the whole picture and this is what should happen. But that's not really what happens on the ground. You know, if you're a law enforcement officer and you're on a perimeter at the corner of 12th and Main and something is going on in a building over there, you don't even have radio communication with what's going on in that building. So you don't even know.
Yeah.
There isn't this whole full blanket of everybody has all the communications going on everywhere and everybody knows what everybody else is doing. It just isn't that way at these scenes. It's very chaotic.
And I think some of the fault of that is television shows that play these things out, every law
That's
enforcement.
An expectation.
Yeah, it's kind of the CSI effect, but on their behaviors. Like, well, they said in the TV shows they have access to all the cameras instantly.
Yes, which
remotely.
We never do. Right. I could tell you the nightmare stories. Hour and a half looking for somebody in the Navy Yard building in downtown Washington, D.C. Cameras all over the building and no access to the cameras. And in fact, didn't even know the cameras existed because the guy who ran the camera systems, when the fire alarm was pulled, locked the room and left the building.
Which was probably the protocol that he was
following
given.
his protocol for a fire drill, right? Nothing wrong with what he did. He was doing exactly what he was told. But that's right. I mean, you're right. I think our expectation is that social media, everything is instant, Instagram, right? Everything is very instant. We watch television shows where everything gets resolved in 15 minutes and then people are standing in the bar having a beer. That's not the reality of really what happens. It's very chaotic. And it isn't until long afterwards. That's why we do after action reports. It isn't until long afterwards when we are able to interview everybody check the transcripts of communications, check phone lines, voicemail messages, text messages, and then we put it all together, and then it all seems really simple.
Yeah.
But it's not simple at the time.
No. So let's talk about it from the public's point of view. What should the public be doing when they think there is a mass shooting event in progress?
Yeah, I think that I like that you asked me that because that forgoes the question about what did they do before. And I think there are things they need to do before.
Let's talk about it.
And so there's two things three things kind of, I think they need to do before. And then if they have done those things, then they'll know what to do when something happens. So if you would oblige me and let me just back up a little bit. We're all familiar with, so the first thing is the classic see something, say something. I think we're familiar with that because we did a great job of marketing that after 9/11 to say, if you see something, you should say something. And, certainly we don't have time today to go through the details of this, but, if you want to know what to see and who to say it to, I'd say, listen to my podcast, my co-podcaster, Sarah Ferris. Our podcast is Stop the Killing. And every week we talk about signs to look for and how to report them and the nuances of who to report them to and when to report them and the struggle and the challenge with reporting it, because nobody wants to say their kid is bad. But the essence of the first thing is see something, say something is an essential part, because we can prevent these, but we can only do it if the people who are around the shooters. FBI research shows law enforcement is 25% likely to get, this is a bastardization of the FBI data, but 25% of the time law enforcement had information about shooters in our initial research. 75% or more family, friends, classmates, 92%. So, spouses, personal relationships, 80-some%. 75% or more friends, family, spouses, classmates, teachers had information that was definable, written, articulable information, and did not share it. And sharing it might have prevented a shooting that actually occurred. So law enforcement's not the one to get it. So that's the see something, say something part. The second part is something that maybe not a lot of people know about. But if I asked you if you'd had a first aid class when you were, if you went through Scouts or, if you were a lifeguard, you would say, oh yeah, I had first aid. But what we never had when I was growing up is we never had any training in how to apply a tourniquet or how to stop when a bleed is occurring. So if you go to stopthebleed.org, you'll see a companion effort. When I was working on our White House team, there was another team working that created stopthebleed.org, which is a way to properly put on a tourniquet, but also properly stop bleeding, excessive bleeding that saves lives. It takes just a few minutes for somebody to bleed enough that we cannot bring them back. Mm-hmm. So if it takes the ambulance 15 minutes to get to your location, and it takes 30 minutes to transport a person to the hospital, if an ambulance and a medical personnel don't get there for 15 minutes, if the law enforcement on the scene or the civilians on the scene don't know how to stop the bleed, when a bone is broken, when somebody's in a car accident, that person will bleed out. So if you can look at stopthebleed.org and get some training and understand the value in you just stopping the bleeding on a bleeding wound, you can save a life. And we know hundreds and hundreds of people have done it. Thousands of people have done it. So if you know how to stop the bleed and you see something and say something when you can, then what that leaves us with is this massive comment about run, hide, fight, which is the third thing. What do you do when something happens? You should have run, hide, fight training ahead of time. You should read a little bit about it because you want to know, you should know that you're capable of doing all those things. But you do want to know, we're all flight or fight individuals. That's our human nature. So we're going to run. That's our first natural reaction is to run. Yeah. So that's why the FBI and the federal government adopted run, hide, fight. The DHS supports run, hide, fight. Not because these are three magic words, but because these are the three actions that people do. Run, hide, fight was developed by the City of Houston Mayor's Office and released in July of 2012. And it's all available in multiple languages. There's huge training programs with it. in addition to just a little 6-minute video. The video itself doesn't have any blood. There's only a couple of gunshot rounds discharged at the first few seconds, so it's relatively low when it comes to trauma. And that's why we relied on that training. But we also know I've done hundreds and hundreds of interviews and been at locations where shootings occurred. I've read so many after actions, and everybody at the scene runs or hides or fights or does some combination of those. Mm-hmm. And so that's what you need to be prepared to do. If you're not in danger, if there's no danger in front of you, then that's where the middle part gets in. Hide, where the schools teach about lockdown. That's where you want to maintain your location if you can, if you're not in danger. But if you're in immediate danger, your safest bet is to run. And I can tell you there are children today who ran from the classrooms at Sandy Hook Elementary School who are now adults and they're alive. There are students from Virginia Tech University who jumped out the second floor window at Norris Hall, and they're alive today because they had the confidence to do that because their instructor, who died holding the door closed, Professor Librescu, he told them, jump out the windows. And they all jumped out the windows. There were a couple of broken ankles and scrapes and things, but all those kids survived because they made the decision to run. Mm-hmm. You cannot be killed if you're not there. So run if you can, hide if you must, and absolutely, you should always fight. And you can fight, even though you might not think you can. You can fight with your fists. You can fight with a group of people. You can fight by pushing. You can fight by holding the door closed. You can fight a lot of ways. And I'll tell you one statistic. When I started to do the research on this with my team at the FBI, probably the most astonishing piece of data that came out of the initial research that I wrote for the FBI was that my team worked on, is that in 21 of 160 instances, so in 13% of the instances, an unarmed civilian safely and successfully stopped a shooting. Oh, wow. An unarmed civilian, 13% of the time.
And that's not 13% of the times that they tried, but 13% of the overall incidents, right?
Those were successful, right? 13% that were successful of the overall incidents, yeah.
So it might have been, and I'm just trying to clarify the statistic. It's not that in 100% of those cases someone tried to fight. It could have been in 25% of the times someone tried to fight, and so that 13% really means it was 50%. I'm exaggerating numbers.
No, I know what you're saying. Yeah.
50% successful when someone tried to fight.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, if I can re-articulate it, I mean, what you're saying is, and I agree with you, we had 160 incidents of active shooter situations, 160 actual public shootings where an individual was actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill people in a crowded area. And in those 160 incidents, there were certainly people who tried to go after an attacker, or there were instances where the shooter killed some people and then left the building and then committed suicide and things like that. And so there were lots of, in some instances where law enforcement came and engaged the shooter, but less of those than so many other things. But where the shooting was stopped at the scene, successfully, 13% of the time, 21 instances where individuals who were facing somebody with a weapon were able to stop the shooting. In some instances, there were, like I mentioned, Professor Librescu at Virginia Tech. He obviously tried to stop the shooter. He was unable to stop the shooter, but he was able to delay him. Yeah. And there's a Sandy Hook teacher, the same thing. They were able to delay the shooter by getting in their way and taking the bullets, and that allowed other people to survive. So, but of the 160 incidents we studied, 13% of them were successfully stopped, and there were other percentages that were stopped, like half of them were for this reason, or 20% were for that reason. 13% of the shootings were stopped by unarmed civilians.
It's pretty amazing.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, it was the most shocking. It was the most shocking piece of information that came out of that. And there was one other shocking detail, that of the shootings where law enforcement had to engage, this is when we decided how important the training was for law enforcement. when law enforcement had to engage the shooter to stop the fighting, to stop the shooting, 47% of the time a law enforcement officer was killed or injured, or both.
Wow.
So half of the time when law enforcement had to engage, we were like, oh, a dead cop is a no good cop. We need to do a better job of getting those law enforcement officers trained so that they can stay alive to save the civilians.
Yeah. It seems to me that each of the run, hide, and fight also have a before element, in a sense. That if you don't know where to run, you don't know where to hide, you haven't thought about how you would fight, that there's a diminished utility to those things.
Yeah, I think that's great that you bring that up too, Chris, because that is the value of thinking about it ahead of time and thinking about it and doing some training in it, because it isn't about run. Some places use avoid, defend, deny. In England, it's run, hide, tell. In other places, they'll say, hey, we want to make sure that we use. I don't know. There's a lot of versions. Some people are trained in Alice, which is a corporation. That's their branding, Alice. All the branding means all the same thing. No matter what words you use, it's the idea that you need to think that you might have to run. And so if you did run, where could you run? Yeah. I'll tell you that most people enter and exit buildings and parking lots in exactly the same way every time. So we see sometimes people, when they go to flee a building when there's a fire, or when they go to flee a building because there's a shooting or anything, or a storm, they go to the same place they came in, even though there is a much safer exit in another location. So the simple thing you can do is look for the exits. In Aurora Theater, at the shooting in Aurora, Colorado, at the theater, the shooter came from the bottom of the theater that was just the amphitheater where the seats go up really high. There were exit doors in the back. And nobody thought to run up and go out the exit doors that are essentially almost on the second level, because they were there, but people were trying to rush out of the doors that they came in, which really put them closer to the line of fire, because they were they had to come down and towards the shooter in order to get out. So it's not a fault of them, those people, by any means. It's the shooter's fault that people got injured or killed. But we can do such a better job of just looking where the exits are when we come into someplace, or not using the exact same doorway every time, so that we know what might be on the other side of that door. It's an observational thing. Be prepared for a potential run for any reason, even if it's a fire or a tornado. Be prepared if you have to hide, because you want to hide someplace, not just on the other side of a piece of wallboard, or a soft pod in your office building. You want to hide inside of a stone bathroom if you can, or if there's no place to hide, ducking under a plastic desk with metal legs is not hiding. And that's what happened in Virginia Tech. Everybody bent down to the floor and then stayed there. That's what happened in the San Ysidro McDonald's, in the 70s. Everybody ducked underneath the plastic desks in the McDonald's. There's no protection. That's not hiding.
Was that a byproduct, you think, of kind of like duck and cover, like earthquake training? That was the only thing they could.
I think that we think about going down, and everybody's going to go down. Everybody's going to flinch. I think what run, hide, fight training gives you and gives everybody is you're welcome to duck down. You're welcome to be shocked, and I don't really think this is reflective of earthquake training as much as it is, because I'm from the Midwest, where we don't have as many earthquakes, and upper Midwest, and it's more a function of freezing. You freeze and you duck down, and everybody does that. We see that happen all the time. That's great, but if you're trained and you're gonna think about survival, you should duck down, freeze, duck down, and then get up and run. That's what you need to do. And that's the practice of knowing ahead of time, I'm not going to stay here. Don't stay someplace where you have no protection. If you have no cover, there's no way to protect you in the spot that you're in, and you're just sitting down on the floor. I've talked to victims who survived, who said, I turned my face away. That's very common. It's very, very common that a victim who survives will say to us afterwards, well, I got down on the floor and then I turned my face away so he wouldn't see me, which of course is nonsensical, but it is the way that we are as humans, we think. And you turn your face away. I've heard so many people I've interviewed who have said things like that. And what we want to empower people to say, go, you know what, go. Even if you go past and at him. I know people who have run from shooters down hallways, and all people say, oh, should I zigzag in the lawn as I run away? No, just go as fast as you can. The bullets go down. When they come out of the barrel, they go down, and they go down and down and down. So the further away you are, the further away you have the better chance you have of not getting hit. And a bullet that hits the ground will skid until it finds its target. I know somebody who got hit in the foot because the bullet hit the ground and then skidded to her. Oh, wow. I know somebody who took a bullet and then shin that way. It kind of reflected off of. You don't think of the bullets being there, but if you lay down on the ground and think you're safer, all you're doing is creating a bigger target
and more vital organs.
More vital organs, right? And so that's the run and the hide. And how often do we have to fight? Very, very rarely. But if you think about fighting to save your life, the life of your child, every person who you interview in your lifetime, if you said to them, would you do anything to save the life of your child? Would you do anything to save the life of your mother? They would say, I would do anything to do that. And that's the determination, the grit you need to have on that rare occasion where you will not give up and you're going to fight. And you would be amazed at how many people have done that in ways that they've done it. I mean, words, and you can fight with your words if you need to, although if somebody's already shot people, they're going to shoot other people, right? And so shooters come in, I'll leave you with this one thought. Shooters come in with an intent, like they have a focus. Yeah. And so they have a plan. They develop this plan and they plan for it. I mean, there's none of this is snapping, right? This is all a planned, targeted violence. So they plan it, they prepare for it, they buy the stuff they want, they get their kit, they get kitted up so that they can pretend to be somebody that they're not really. And they have this plan to do X. And they don't have a plan to have anybody intercede. Mm-hmm. They're not planning for, this, once I do this, and then that guy is going to come running after me. So I've seen some amazing video footage. I've talked to people who have interceded, and the shooters are not expecting anybody to interrupt them. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, up in Wisconsin, there was a shooter who was shooting at a facility, a Sikh temple, actually, and the law enforcement arrived and they had their sirens on, and that threw the shooter off. And so the shooter, when he came out of the building, we think he might have been going around to try to go after people who were exiting out a back door. But when he saw law enforcement, it completely changed his plans. He forgot about all the people he was trying to kill, and he turned towards law enforcement. Mm-hmm. And we see that a lot, where one distraction, one thing, people fighting back. There's a great video you can pull off YouTube from Seattle Pacific University of a building monitor at the university who was a kid, college kid, who saw a shooter come in. The shooter didn't see him, and he walked around beside the shooter and grabbed his shotgun and on the side, so kid couldn't shoot. Started shaking it and shaking it and shaking it, and knocked the guy down on the ground. He took the shotgun away. He went and got some mace, sprayed the guy. The guy pulled a knife out. I mean, very quickly, the whole plan, went downhill as far as the shooters, because he didn't expect that somebody else would intercede. And you can do that in so many different ways. And if your life depends on it, if the life of your family depends on it, if you want your family to see you when you come home, you have nothing to lose and everything to gain.
Is there any particular fighting actions that were more effective than others? I always tell my wife, if anything happens, you play as dirty as you possibly can.
Well, the answer is yes. There are no rules in street fighting, and you do whatever you can do. Throw anything at them, hit them anywhere, kick them anywhere, gouge their eyes out, whatever you want. It's a very generally it's a very momentary fight. We're not talking about we're not talking about a situation where you have to fight to the death in a 15-minute brawl on the ground.
Yeah, it's
There are other
not the
people
Bourne
around.
Identity.
Exactly right. Because think about it. These shootings that occur, they occur in public, and the public comes and joins in. They do the pile-on game, which is fantastic. I love it. When you see somebody who does something improper and stupid and criminal out in public, and then the public kind of piles on and says, "We're just going to flatten you on the ground until we can get law enforcement here." So you're not alone. And I think that where some people have fought back, that's one of the things that they've seen. And in, say, for instance, in a school where 4 or 5 people have tackled somebody, you act quickly, you do it all together. So it's kind of a question of, use the resources you have. If you're only one person, you're picking up whatever you can. If you're a bunch of people, you're using a little gang activity right on them, and that's good. But yeah, I mean, it's more fast. Right? It's more confident in knowing that you can succeed.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that's the part about the fight part, is that nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to fight to stave off of a shooter. But, if you were being mugged on a platform at the subway, or, in your school parking lot, or at the mall, and you had an opportunity to fight somebody who was trying to hurt you, you would fight them. It's better that you fight them than to just let them kill you. So, I mean, there are lots of techniques. All of them work. The bottom line is, as long as you cause a disruption, you're good. And usually, a lot of other civilians are present and can help you. So you just have to have the knowledge to know, run, hide, fight are your options. Apply any or all of them, and execute them as long as you need to.
Gotcha. And so the reality for parents, I think, on how safe are your kids in school. Is our fears worse than the reality?
Way. Children are much more at risk in their homes for a host of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
In 2020, the CDC reported more than 500 unintentional deaths by firearms, and those were, primarily the highest number were kids. Those are primarily kids who found unsecured guns and killed family members or friends, right? So it's not only just the accidental, the gun that's left out that some child uses, but domestic violence. Kids are much more likely to be injured in a domestic violence situation at their home. Murder, suicide situations that cause a child's death, but also domestic violence causing a child's injury. Whether it's by a parent or a step parent, or somebody who a parent is dating, things like that. So children are way more likely to be injured in their own home by accident, by intentional discharge of a firearm or another weapon, by domestic abuse, and compared to in schools. Schools are way safer for kids, and we saw those numbers change even when the pandemic occurred and kids were home all the time. They're at a higher risk at home. That's not that homes are dangerous. It's just that there's more activity that the child might be engaged in that might result in their harm, whether it's an accident, literally an accident, falling off of down a stairs or something, an accident, an intentional act, such as with a firearm or another weapon, or domestic abuse. But yeah, kids are much safer in schools than they are at home.
Gotcha.
I think we think that. I think that because they're not in our charge, right? So we think, oh, I don't know what's going to happen to them there. But I think if you turn it around and you say, how often do these school shootings happen? Not nearly as often as you think they do.
Yeah.
It's a very rare occurrence in elementary school, super rare occurrence in an elementary school. And when it does, then it's news for a month.
Yeah.
And then middle school and high school shootings are generally middle school and high school shooters from that school, right? So the better and stronger your school programs are, the better the schools are able, and the better your parents are in supporting those neighborhoods and the neighbors are, the stronger your school is in being able to find a potential shooter who is their own student. Then the better you're able to find that student before they shoot somebody, or before they fire. Occasionally, and we do certainly have, I don't want to disregard the fact that we have people who leave school, kicked out of school, 18, 19, 20, 21, that age group, all primarily males, certainly have come back to shoot at schools. And when they do, it's generally their school.
Yeah. So if people want to find out more about what you do, your books, where can they go?
KatherineSchweit.com is a great place to start. KatherineSchweit.com, KatherineSchweit.com. I have 2 books out. Coincidentally, I have them here. Stop the Killing, How to End the Mass Shooting Crisis, and How to Talk About Guns with Anyone, which I just really wrote the latter one because I want some facts out on the table. So when people are talking about firearms and violence, they have better facts. People always say, are you for or against guns? Yeah. It's not for or against guns. It's better knowledge about the gun laws, it's gun policy, gun culture, what the Supreme Court has said, what the statutes say. That's what that little book is about. So I would be thrilled for anybody to listen for free to the podcast, Stop the Killing, which you can find you can download on Amazon, Apple Podcast, wherever you find your podcasts, Spotify. So that's where I am. Or you can find me sitting here in my office, which is a mess right now because I'm recording an audiobook. I'm recording this in audio format. So my office is covered in moving blankets right now. But I appreciate that you found the time to find me today.
Katherine, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for sharing this information. I think it's so important, and I really appreciate that you spent the time to do this. Thank you.
You're welcome.